as everyone, as Dmitry, hi, welcome Dmitry to the Welsh Republic podcast Space One, and to hi everyone who's listening here. Sorry about the first bit because I'm new. This is the first space, but yeah. But anyways, welcome everyone to the Welsh Republic podcast Space One. I'm here with Dmitry from the great show World War Now. How's your day been, Dmitry? Has it been going good?
So far, so good. Just engaging. Had my coffee. I'm all awake, ready to go. But there is always a bit of anxiety. I'm someone who I like to be prepared, but I think for an interview such as this one, really, I think it's all about just being genuine, truly, and not really. I mean, just answering the questions, I think, as accurately as possible. Because really, unfortunately, you'll see with a lot of the subject matter that we'll discuss today, a lot of it is incredibly interesting, but there isn't that sort of accurate, crystal clear, clarifying information available in the English language. So what we'll be talking about today, I think, will primarily people just want to know, I think, what is really the reality behind all of these things. And I'm not saying I'm like the only source, but I think of many of the users on X, the political commentators, people of that nature, I think I've had a pretty fair run of a lot of the information sources in Russian and English, and I've managed to filter through a lot of the garbage over the last, I would say, well, since I've been a teenager, really, since for the last 15 years, which is quite a long time now that you think about it, approaching the second decade of historical, political analysis, and it's pretty incredible. It's been very fruitful so far, and yeah, I think people just want to hear snippets about a lot of this very peculiar subject matter that we discuss, even on the World War Now show. Really, I mean, I think a lot of people find the podcast interesting because it sort of bridges that gap between obviously spiritual, mystical subjects, things that pertain to history, and maybe you cannot speak about without some form of censorship or filtration, and modern day geopolitical events, which was the on the outset the first subject matter we were discussing, the war raging on in Eastern Europe. So I think all these things and all of these subject matter, it's all really at the forefront. But yeah, I'm doing amazing today, as always. I think there's nothing really to be complaining about, but thank you for asking. So yeah, there are a lot of ideas running around in my head right now because obviously so much is happening. So I do feel slightly overwhelmed, I think, by the news. But yeah, this should be a very relaxing conversation. Thank you, Welsh.
So, Dimitri, tell me about yourself. What has been your journey into Orthodox Christianity, and how did you and Conrad start the World War Now show?
I was basically introduced to Conrad through mutual friends in 2022. So at the beginning, essentially, of the special military operation, right about then, and during this time I began to really up my activity on X, in particular Twitter, only because there was a lot of fake news information. I always felt very, very, very strongly about Ukraine's matters. I followed, basically, me and my close friends, we followed the entire Russian Spring, as you can call it, in the Donbass, in Lugansk, Donetsk, etc., since 2014, even since the Maidan began, really, in 2013. But everything was followed very closely. We followed a lot of the commanders, read all of the original interviews. The whole thing was very close to home. Most of, well, myself, family, friends, we all have relatives or ancestry that comes from that particular region, from the Ukraine, right? Different parts of it, whether it's Kharkov, Crimea, some of the areas where the Cossacks once resided. So having family from there and having literally blood ties to that land, I think it hit home in 2014. I realized, for myself at least, that we're actually living during a historical event, and this historic event in particular, it may be like a tragic one. It's obviously very acute what's happening between the Russian and Ukrainian people. I didn't understand, I think, the scope of it, but I could feel it. I could definitely and so I began obviously posting. I think started posting late. If only I began to show more activity online when I first had this inkling. But in some ways, the fact that I held off in 2014 from really being active in online spaces as a teenager was probably a good idea, because I wasn't as mature back then. I did need some years to mentally, I think, acquaint myself with exactly how to put forward information. And also, it was just a very volatile time in general. But myself and Conrad, we've been working together since 2022. I myself, obviously, I've been Orthodox Christian my entire life. I've come from an Orthodox Christian family, both my parents, ancestors, etc. Basically, you can say all eight of my great grandfathers and grandmothers were Orthodox Christian to some extent. Some belong to the old believers, actually, which is an interesting question on my mother's side. So they were actually not members of the Orthodox Church, but you can say by adjacency, they were still very close to Orthodoxy. So it's kind of like, for myself, coming to politics and coming to analyze, obviously, historical events, the Russian monarchist movement, which I think are maybe the largest account covering this subject matter alongside Conrad, of course, on X, which is very interesting because obviously we know, according to the prophecies of the Orthodox Church, that not only will there be obviously a restoration of Istanbul, Constantinople, but also there will obviously, and I think clearly, if the Russian people repent, there will be a Russian Tsar and the monarchy will be restored. I'm kind of jumping around subjects, but what I wanted to say was being brought up Orthodox really gave me that solid foundation in really coming to terms with the fact that our reality that we live in Welsh, it's actually imperfect, and it has been very far from ideal since at least 1917. And at that time, it was less than 100 years. And basically, coming to mature as a teenager and as a young adult, it was very clear to me that in this world, you can, either like participate and just be a good goy, or and sort of hide your head in the sand, or you can contribute to making essentially into somehow improving the world, but not in the tikkun olam type of fashion, but making of being the best Christian and somehow enlightening those around you. And I had this gift of memorizing information very well from books, in particular from listening to lectures. And so this information retention has obviously, I think, pushed me somewhat ahead of certain peers. Especially, you've noticed we've spoken to some Russian experts from Russia, and even they're a little bit taken aback because a lot of the information we put out on the show doesn't necessarily even correlate with the content that is taught in Russian high schools, middle schools, even universities, which is unfortunate. But and obviously Conrad's incredibly talented. I kind of see him, and I saw him at the beginning of our journey together as probably a younger Tucker Carlson, essentially. And that's what I see. He's very gifted, much more talented than I am. But everyone has their own different gifts, so I think we work well together. But I think me personally, I've had a very interesting intellectual journey. I from around 2011 until COVID, I had basically 9 years of just intellectual. Not just I kept reading, I kept consuming information about Orthodoxy, about history, about Russia, Byzantium, well, a huge subject. Like one of my most interesting. I have an entire library about the books about the Eastern Roman Empire, essentially, in the Russian language. So there was all these great books re-released, for obviously written in past centuries in Russian, from ancient Greek and from Middle Ages Greek, basically, and about the Byzantine Empire. And yeah, so consuming all of that really, I think, armed me for having these sort of conversations today. And I've been very fortunate. I've obviously followed Alexander Dugin for a long time as well, who you've interviewed on your great podcast. And I was one of myself, as well as maybe Michael Milliman, are probably the largest consumers of Professor Dugin's content. In fact, I think I've probably, even before Michael Milliman, I've listened to the majority of Alexander Dugin's lectures. And I mean, literally on the website Yevrazia.tv, I listened to hundreds of hours of Alexander Dugin speak on various subjects, everything from sociology to geopolitics to, of course, his opinions on various religions and religious traditions. And I have to say, Alexander Dugin, if not, I think by proxy, he was more or less a remote teacher of mine. I think I don't agree with him entirely about all of his positions, but he basically helped kickstart basically into overdrive, my ability to analyze historical and religious events. It's actually amazing. So Alexander Dugin, I will always be, obviously, I think, thankful and grateful to him, even though today, obviously, his political opinions, and even back then, I now realize that he wasn't correct about many things. But generally speaking, because of his charisma, his ability to speak Russian with such clarity and such eloquence, it has I think really opened up my mind. Has contributed to my intellectual growth a lot more than some of the, so to speak, mainstream, shall we say, like lecturers, historians, and yeah, it's really interesting. Alexander Dugin, I do owe him a lot. I consumed pretty much the majority of his content between 2011 and 2015, and I mean historically, that is moving backwards. So everything Dugin ever said between like the year 2000 and 2015, I've pretty much, you know, read or listened to. So in some ways, I can almost like predict what he will say next. You can call me maybe like a Duganist, but I'm really not. It's just he fascinated me back then as a very unique intellectual figure. And yeah, no. And look, one day I do want to interview him myself as well. I have a lot of questions, as you can imagine, like built up over the years. And yeah, no, it's just fascinating. But I think Orthodoxy has helped defend me against a lot of the false ideas and beliefs that you can see plaguing, obviously, the political intellectual space. Welsh, as you can, obviously there are all kinds of traps that are thrown at people, whether it's liberalism, communism, evangelicalism, sometimes even like various forms of radical Islam, or even forms of like, I would just say, psyope, Whignatty, white supremacy movements, which again, there's obviously a real form of white nationalism that's available to especially Western Americans, right? To people in the West in general. But some of these, I would just say, maybe co-opted movements, Orthodoxy has kept me, I would say, insulated and safe from all of them. So I'm very grateful for my parents for for actually raising me in the faith. I think it's protected me from wasting time. And I think time is, honestly, at this point, I think time is like a real treasure for all of us because it helps us learn, helps us build ourselves up, and and how we use it is very important. So I think in some ways, despite the fact that I didn't never had to really come to the faith, I still had a growing up journey, realizing how does orthodoxy mesh with the political reality of our world today, and that was a real growing exercise in and of itself. Because simply going to church doesn't necessarily prepare you for the reality in which we live in, which is frankly apocalyptic, as you can probably agree after.
Can you hear me, Dmitry? Are you
Yes,
there?
Welsh. Yes, sorry about that. Someone was
Yeah.
giving me a call.
Yeah.
You're all good.
Yeah. Keep going, mate. Like you were saying.
Yeah, no. So yeah, basically, I think the I'm very thankful for some of the other Russian figures, in particular Vladimir Dugin. Sorry, Alexander Dugin had a great friend, Vladimir Igorovich Karpets. He was a Russian, again, university lecturer, a former lawyer. His father worked for the Soviet state. He was a Russian historian. He wrote one of the best books I've ever read in my life. It still is literally a top three book if we don't count Holy Scripture. It's called Rus Meroveyeva, which I guess translates to Rus of Meroveus. It's a historical book, but it was basically a deep dive into Russian history and Orthodox Christian eschatology in one. One day I do want to translate it into English. I think that would be an absolute honor. Plus, I don't think it impacted other people as much as it has myself. It basically completely reinforced. I mean, I was always a monarchist for my entire life, but this basically, with like iron nails, cemented the idea that Orthodox Christian monarchy really, for us Orthodox Christians, is the only path forward and really the only ideal which we should advocate for unequivocally, right? So this is a non-negotiable position. And that book by Alexander Dugin's friend, who unfortunately, before I could even meet him in person, he passed away in January of 2017. So, Lord rest his soul. But he was an amazing contributor. I used to read his blogs pretty much on a daily basis, every second day. I used to follow him closely, and that book was, yeah, something. Again, I don't agree with Vladimir Igorovich Karpets on everything, but his view of monarchism in Russia, its essentiality to the future of the Russian people and orthodoxy, as well as just in general his political. He had this. He had almost this purity, as if he was a person who was teleported to our reality and our time from 300 years ago. He had this interesting like view of the world, almost completely devoid of any sort of enlightenment, weird, self-imposed ideas that the Western world is so corrupted by. he was almost like completely purified himself of those ideas, and he had a very strictly, I would say, very wholesome Orthodox Christian traditional worldview, which is, I mean, insanely rare. So Alexander Dugin introduced me to him, and from him, of course, I learnt about the great Nicholas Kozlov, whose books we are translating at the moment on Substack. And Nicholas Kozlov, obviously, this is pretty much the peak of Russian Orthodox Christian anti-Semitism. I don't think it can look. This is an interesting subject in and of itself, but this is the absolutely most likely the most radical Orthodox Christian historian, political theorist I've ever read, in terms of like his knowledge of Orthodox Christian tradition, plus Holy Scripture exegesis, plus the political reality in which we live, and conspirology, you can almost call it, is incredible. So we are obviously working and trying to translate some of his articles and books on our Substack, and only because there really isn't a second Nicholas Kozlov in Russia or in the world, frankly. And I hope he's doing okay. He is a very off the radar kind of guy, shall I say. I think he lives somewhere deep in Siberia and has pretty much almost no connection to the internet. So he's off the grid as far as he can be. But notice how basically as a teenager, I basically found Alexander Dugin, and then from him I found Karpets and then Nicholas Kozlov, and now we're here, and many other, of course, interesting based and red-pilled figures along the way. But it's really curious how I think in some ways God has protected me, and even though Alexander Dugin had some bad ideas, even today he has some incorrect ideas, somehow I managed to extract only the best from him, and that has instilled itself in my mind. And all the extra, maybe Eurasian-y, weird, non-Russian stuff has been, somewhat expelled. And I think I think my personal intellectual journey, I'm still fascinated by it, because maybe one day if I become a person of importance, I'll write like an autobiography, because it is very interesting how I've sort of had this learning journey, and that has brought around amazing results. But there were so many moments where I could have followed or read the wrong things, or my mind could have been clouded by some false ideology, and I could have wasted months, if not years, of my life. And yet that has never happened, which is insane. And I think that's obviously not because of my sort of superior discretionary ability, but I think, Welsh, that's probably God, or through the prayers of my relatives, parents, or whomever, guiding me along the right path, and not being too enthralled by various ideologies, and just trying to stick to the truth, and whilst still having this insane sort of this open-minded ability to just read about things, but not necessarily be enslaved by them. I don't know. I think it's, if anything, that's probably my talent and gift, is having that ability, like having that strong Orthodox foundation, and yet not really faltering, irrespective of what I read, or listen to.
That was a great summary of what you just said there. Dmitry, what would you say in Russia is your favorite Orthodox church to go to, like one that you really like? And what is your favorite, like, Orthodox Christian book that you've written, one that you really admire and really love, like the most, and favorite tale from Orthodox Christianity?
I think in terms of favorite church, probably, I mean, this church I somewhat feel a connection to. This is the church on the blood of, built at the spot where Saint Dmitry of Uglich was martyred, right? So this church is located just outside of Moscow in the Yaroslavskoye Oblast. So this was the youngest son of Tsar Ivan IV, Ivan Grozny, and he was killed under mysterious circumstances in the late 1500s, right? So this was a young prince, and he was murdered. And on the place of his martyrdom, they built this great Orthodox Christian church, which is actually in the background of my old PFP, that red church. And it's just an amazing spot, obviously far away from any like main roads, and it's Yaroslavskoye Oblast is quite isolated. It's not like mainstream Moscow central business district. I've always had a pull to that area, and obviously the story of Saint Dmitry has always been very close to me. He's an amazing saint, not spoken about as much. He is a child saint, and obviously a great miracle worker as well. So that church in Uglich, which is a small town in Russia today, is probably my favorite. I think it's the Church on Spilled Blood in English is the official name in English. But in terms of favorite book, I think that would have to be. Look, I just mentioned Rus Miroveeva, but the other book that absolutely is, it's basically a portal back in time. This would be the book. Let me just check the English name of it. It's Leto Господня. It's basically called The Summer of God, and it was written by a Russian emigre, so a Russian who survived the Bolshevik purges, Ivan Shmelyov, and he wrote this book. Leto Господня it describes basically the book is about a young boy and his family, and it basically, in very simple terms, only talks about what life was like in Russia before the revolution. I think it's obviously a fictional book, but it's set in the somewhere around the late 1800s, and it describes how life is like in the Russian village nearby a small town. It describes how the young boy and his family are preparing for Easter. How they're literally in this period that we're in right now, going through Great Lent. It talks about the various feast days, how the boy goes to school, how he goes to church. It describes Russian life in the most vivid details. And initially I heard about the book that it was basically the only book of its sort, almost as if it's a magical text. It relays the life of the time precisely how it was, to the point where you had Russians who left Russia after the revolution and the Russian Civil War. They would read this book and they would simply cry. They couldn't hold back their tears because this Summer of God book by Ivan Shmelyov, it just basically brought them back to that time where Russia was still uncorrupted. Very much in certain parts of Russia there was this Christian innocence, which maybe was very similar to how certain parts of the world were during the first centuries of Christianity in the Middle East, in the Levant and Anatolia and other places. So this one book, and when I did read it, I was already prepared for it to be good, and I wasn't disappointed. It was The Summer of God, or Lord's Summer, I guess it would be called, is insane by Ivan Shmelyov. It's like the must read. In fact, people should frankly be reading that in Russian schools and high schools, as instead of, for example, even look, and I love Alexander Solzhenitsyn, but folks should be reading Summer of God instead of Archipelago Gulag. The Archipelago Gulag is a great book, like, no doubt, but I think it in some ways, well, actually, maybe we'll kind of get to that later on. I'm not saying it's a bad book. This one, instead, it kind of portrays exactly what the pure Russian ideal was back in the day, and that, I mean, it just paints such a beautiful picture of what a true, well-balanced Orthodox Christian lifestyle, how it was possible before the revolution, and how that was taken from the Russian people for their sin and for their apostasy. So, yeah, that would be the book recommendation. And what was the third question you asked, Welsh?
The third question I asked was pretty much that, like your favorite book.
Yeah, but there was something else. There was a church book. Oh, you mentioned Russian.
Your favorite church, your favorite church, and your favorite piece of Orthodox artwork that you love.
Artwork, hard to pinpoint. I mean, there's so many great icons. Rublev's Trinity is beautiful. I mean, it's harmonious. My favorite icon is probably the sovereign icon of the Theotokos, so the Державная икона Богородицы, which is, the icon has an interesting story because it appeared to the Russian Orthodox people on the same day and maybe even in the same hour and minute as the so-called abdication of Tsar Nicholas II happened. So when the revolution started and it happened, suddenly this woman who lived in the Kolomenskoye Selo, which is a village outside of Moscow, she had a dream, and the Mother of God appeared in her dream, and she said, go to this church, and in the church basement you will find an icon. And you need to uncover this icon and bring it into the church. And so this woman, listened to her dream, obeyed it, went to her priest, told her priest about it. Her priest said, look, we don't, as Orthodox Christians, believe in dreams. You should just forget about it. Don't worry. Just go back to sleep. All right. She had the dream a few nights later again. The second time, she told her priest. They went into the basement of this church, and they did in fact find an icon that was roughly, I believe, 100 years old at the time. So it was painted somewhere around the time of Napoleon's invasion of Russia, maybe a little bit earlier, but it was about 100 years. And this is 1917, by the way. This is happening in February, March, as the first steps of the revolution are being enacted, and Tsar Nicholas II is being imprisoned at the Stanция Dno next to Pskov, away from the front lines, and as the generals are conspiring against them, and the Freemasons as well. So this icon of the Theotokos, the Mother of God, is sitting there on a throne. There is the child Christ on her lap, and the Theotokos she's wearing this these red vestments. She has the scepter in her hand, like the royal scepter. She also is holding the royal apple, so like the globus, in her hand. So basically, um, she has the two attributes of royal power, and on her head there's a crown. And there aren't always crowns on the head of the Mother of God in every single icon, but in this one there is. And the way the saints interpreted this icon appearing is that the Mother of God basically has taken upon herself the royal regalia after the Russian people revolted against their sovereign. And one day she's looking after at least that scepter of royal power until it's returned to the Russian people. So there are some incorrect interpretations of this miraculous icon, which this icon still exists. It's in Moscow. You can visit it. It's a well-known icon. But for me, that's probably my most favorite icon. In fact, dare I say, like, this idea, it doesn't belong to me. I won't be plagiarizing or stealing it. But the person I mentioned earlier, Alexander Dugin's friend and one of my, I would say, intellectual teachers, Vladimir Karpets, he said that what the Russian government should do today is to take this icon that appeared miraculously during the revolution, and they should put, for example, during this time when Russia doesn't have a Tsar and an emperor, and God hasn't revealed him to us yet, they should actually put the royal throne at the back of the Duma, behind the speaker of the Russian parliament, and they should bring in, through an Orthodox Christian procession, that Orthodox Christian icon, and hang it up in the Russian parliament, in the Duma, just above the throne, as a symbol of Russia essentially praying. And there should be prayers, obviously, at the beginning of every Duma seat. Every time Parliament opens in Russia, there should be prayers to the Mother of God to restore, to pray to her Son, the Son of God, to restore Orthodox Christian monarchy in Russia. So this idea, Igor Karpets had it, and I think it's absolutely beautiful. So that icon is probably my favorite icon, and truly it is, I think, of incredible significance to Russia today. Sadly, very underappreciated by, obviously, popular politicians in Russia, media figures, and even people in various dissident movements. Except Orthodox Christian monarchists and based in red pill people, right wing people, understand what this icon means, and for them, it is also a very important icon. So, in terms of favorite artwork, I would say it's this particular icon of the Theotokos, where she's wearing red. She has the signs of the insignia of royal powers on her. Absolutely, I think. Sorry, long-winded answer, but I think there's almost a story behind every one of these questions in a way, because there's no other way really to answer it without going into details. And thank you for letting me do that.
Dmitry, that's all good. That's fine. You're a very passionate person. I admire that you. So the next question I wanted to ask you, Dmitry, is about the Bolshevik Revolution. How, the effects, so for instance, how did this revolution succeed? What was its effects on the world? And what facts should people know about it? And also, not to mention how a lot of people talk about how there's a connection to it with the French Revolution. You get what I mean, Dmitry? There with the French Revolution and the Bolshevik Revolution. And why don't they talk about the Talmudic Bolsheviks' killings of millions of Orthodox Christians? Go ahead. You know what I mean? Go.
Well, I think to answer, one of the most important facts to know about the revolution is that it was clearly supported in large part by a large population of the Russian people. So Russians did, in fact, commit apostasy. There were Russians who did, in fact, betray their Tsar. They betrayed not just their Tsar, they fell away from the faith entirely. And there were Russians who, mind you, committed treason, betrayed their own country, and they went along with the fanciful words of people who, frankly, only wanted to destroy Russia, and they did succeed in destroying Russia, and to a large extent. Especially Russian culture was completely beheaded and nullified. I mean, everything from music, architecture, the way people dressed, how people lived, what they ate, what they consumed, how they prayed, was all removed or in some way changed, completely metamorphized. And it's that's the outcome. So, but obviously, we all understand that the leaders of this Bolshevik Revolution were of the Talmudic extraction, and that's, there's no denying that. At some point, especially during the most sensitive, and I would say, because think about it this way: just like with most medicines and most projects, it needs to be kick-started into action, right? A rocket, for example, flying off into the atmosphere needs the most fuel at the beginning of the launch. And the same thing with the Bolshevik Revolution. At the beginning, it needed strict Talmudic leadership. And so obviously, it was led, the Bolshevik Party at the very beginning, for the first 4 to 5 years, was led exclusively by this tyrannic triumvirate, similar to ancient Rome when you had Pompey, Caesar, and Crassus running the Roman Republic, right? Right at its end, before obviously all the various civil wars began. But Soviet Russia, in its early period, during the Civil War, during the Revolutionary period, was run essentially by three people. One of them we know, that's Lenin Ulyanov Blank, obviously at least a quarter, of the Talmudic extraction, and probably worse than that, most likely a member of Masonic lodges based on his extensive time spending in Europe. So think about it this way. We like to attack, for example, Alexei Navalny in Russia as this liberal politician and dissident, but Navalny himself, he spent less time in America and in Europe and in liberal Western countries than Lenin did. Lenin spent, I believe, close to 2 decades living abroad. So there was plenty of time for him to become acquainted with everything. I mean, degenerate Bolshevism and liberalism could bring about, including, of course, sexual deviancy, things like that, which potentially Lenin was at least bisexual, as strange as that may be. But it shouldn't be, because he was an atheist. So, hey, no moral and ethical lines. Now, the second figure of that, obviously, tremendous destructive force, the leadership of the early Soviet Bolshevik Republic was, well, as we know him today, Trotsky, right? Lev Bronstein. Originally, I believe he came from a Talmudic family from either it was Kherson or Nikolaev, around that area. So basically that Novorossiya area that the Russians are fighting for today. He had very wealthy relatives. At that point during the revolution, they lived abroad in Sweden. He came actually from money, so he wasn't a factory worker. He wasn't ever a beggar or anything. He wasn't oppressed himself, obviously being from that particular tribe. And we know about Trotsky, a very cruel person personally, very charismatic, like Lenin. All three of these top three guys were insanely charismatic. So they had, to describe it, they had aura in like the worst way possible, including probably more so than Stalin, because Trotsky, for example, could give amazing, eloquent speeches. He did not stutter at all. He did not repeat himself. Lenin as well. Lenin had, of course, he couldn't pronounce certain letters correctly. For example, the letter R. You'd notice, and that's probably because of his, Jewish ancestry. Lenin couldn't roll his R's. He would say, and that's, with Russian, you have to use the tip of your tongue to roll your R's. And some people of Jewish heritage cannot roll their R's with their tip of the tongue, because it's just biology has, developed them that way. And certain people in Europe cannot roll their tongues either, but Russians can. So Lenin couldn't roll his R's, but he was a charismatic, good speaker anyway, even despite this, physical defect. Trotsky was insanely charismatic, very, very talented, very smart, like devilishly smart. And obviously Trotsky wrote plenty of literature thereafter, even in retirement, even after he was, removed from power by Stalin and friends. The third figure is probably the most mysterious, underappreciated, not spoken about, and probably why. I mean, God has essentially removed him from this earth quite early on, and that is the figure of Yakov Sverdlov. Sverdlov is, if Trotsky is nicknamed the Red Demon of the Revolution, Sverdlov was called the Black Demon of the Revolution. So this is the third and last figure of the triumvirate of power in early Bolshevik Russia to kickstart the entire event. It's almost like in bodybuilding when when you take the supplement creatine, you need to dose. You can, for example, dose very heavy in the first week. For example, the same thing with the Bolsheviks. They needed to dose the first years of the revolution quite intensely with the most Talmudic fervor, and they needed the best people who specialize in terrorism, subverting society, and killing as many people as possible in a very effective manner, torturing who need, torture the correct people, execute others, blackmail others. They needed professionals to carry out the revolution in the first years, and later on, it basically, as if for inertia, it would basically move itself forward, and it certainly did. I mean, until literally 1991, and some could argue the Bolshevik Revolution continues to roll on today, especially if you see the behavior of certain Russian politicians, like well and truly, they do follow in the footsteps of these three people. But about Yakov Sverdlov, very important. Obviously, he was directly related to most likely the group of people who carried out the murder of Tsar Nicholas II and his family. So he was a known terrorist who had specialized terrorist cells in the city of Yekaterinburg, where the royal family was martyred, even before 1918 and 1917. And like 1904 and 5, during the Great Russian War against terrorism, Sverdlov was participating in basically terrorist activities in those exact like West Siberian regions. So this man was incredibly, obviously talented. He had a huge reach. He had a large connection to the banking industry on Wall Street as well. Obviously, in America, his brother was actually Benjamin Sverdlov was working as a banker in America alongside Jacob Schiff and some of the other famous banking elites in New York. His other brother was apparently a convert to Christianity, and he was a Freemason. So the entire Sverdlov family needs to be studied, but specifically Yakov Sverdlov, the third member, was incredibly destructive. He fortunately for everyone in Russia died very early on, and this is why we don't hear about him. And usually you would think the first three leaders of Russia were in fact Trotsky, Lenin, and then Stalin, for example. But no, Stalin held maybe the sixth or seventh or eighth important position. He wasn't even in the top three in the early years. He came to prominence a lot later, and some of us may contemplate if Sverdlov didn't die under mysterious circumstances in 1919 or 1920, whenever he died in the early years, perhaps he would have risen to replace Lenin after Lenin's stroke and Lenin's early demise in, was it 1925 or 1926? So in some way, Sverdlov, God made sure to take this particular, cancerous parasite from us very early. But of course, others remained. But specifically in the Russian context, the reason the Russian Revolution succeeded is because the Russian population chose to let it succeed. It was an internal, in a way, similar to how the American population today is allowing somebody like Trump to send the American Navy to war. There is obviously a portion of the population who are literally, they want America to become left wing. There's nothing Trump or any conservative can do about that. You cannot change the nature of whatever percentage it is of the population, 20, 30% who want somebody like Hillary Clinton or Kamala Harris in power. Like that would completely obviously melt social norms and standards and make society much more left wing. But these people are self-destructive. They want that irrespective of anything. And obviously you have Christian Zionists and others. Russia had the same problem on every single layer of society. So every single social strata and caste, if you will, including the so-called farmers, peasants, workers in factories, for example, would apostatize en masse. There were all kinds of problems. Even members of the clergy sometimes also were leaning towards liberal, sometimes socialist and degenerate ideas, similar to how a lot of the clergy in Ukraine fell away from the church in 2018, and even probably theoretically before that, which is why Ukraine has a second false church. And notice a lot of the members of that false church were initially Orthodox years ago, but they fell away from the faith. Same thing happened in Russia. And sadly, the population was just very lukewarm to a larger extent, right? There was a huge portion of the population that was lukewarm, and they simply did not understand the results of their misbehavior and betrayal. Sadly, like this is the sad reality we have to face is that their inability to understand that all they needed to do was follow Orthodox Christian tradition and remain loyal and follow the commandments of God and not betray their Tsar, their church, their faith, and actually do what their ancestors did. And, just strive to improve themselves in terms of like striving to be better Christians, as opposed to transforming society either in a left-wing liberal fashion, like in France or the British Empire, or the so-called left-wing socialist fashion, which many of these political parties were trying to push this particular ideal, right? The factories to the people, the land to the peasants, all these bizarre slogans which never eventuated. In fact, we know what happened in the USSR, and that is a return to serfdom with kolkhoze, sovkhoze, all of these collective farms. Like that does not actually, the revolution did not result in the people owning any land and factories. We know who ran the factories and the farms. That was the Communist Party of the USSR. So basically, it was an elite at the top. But instead of the royal family and a Tsar or an Orthodox emperor, the person who owned everything was not basically in a singular form. It was a collective oligarchy of essentially very shady quasi-Talmudic leaders. And largely, I think we can also appreciate just the descent into atheism as well. I mean, that to a large part, Welsh, I think describes that the Russian people, to a large extent already by that point in 1917, in their own hearts have committed apostasy. They just needed a good opportunity to release all of these inner demons within themselves. There's a reason why Dostoevsky's books, right? Demons, for example, that same book, or Brothers Karamazov, notice this sort of dread running in the background of these texts, almost as if Dostoevsky, who wrote 50 years prior to the revolution, he could foretell that these events, like there is something strange occurring, amidst the souls of certain Russian peoples. Sadly, Russia was infected by a certain disease, and this disease festered. And frankly, there was nothing I think anyone could have done, because an event such as the 1917 revolution never happened in history before. There's not in the Eastern Roman Empire nor in Russian history. It's something completely unprecedented, which now we know what happens when people are brainwashed or certain ideas are proliferated in society that leads to a mass corruption and apostasy. They had none of these fears or paranoias back then. In some way, people were, I mean, obviously, people who are now distancing themselves from Orthodoxy and Christianity were already welcoming the revolution because they thought, well, what's the worst that could happen? Now we know. Now, of course, hindsight is quite perfect for us. 100 years removed, we know exactly what the results could be. Or almost next year, it'll be 110 years. So really, we are reaching a certain anniversary. But the Russian Revolution is the biggest event which still hasn't been, I think, realized, digested, and repented for. In Russia today, there are no collective calls for repentance of this apostasy by our ancestors. And I mean, everyone, including myself, I had great uncles who became Bolsheviks. They literally, and I don't know the details about their lives, but I can probably estimate that these people, my great grandparents, cousins, for example, they most likely turned away from the church and they cursed themselves and they died during the Civil War, which is a horrific fate, dying away from Christ and betraying your own country and trying to follow people like Trotsky and Lenin. Many Russian, genetically, culturally, ethnic Russian people did that. So it wasn't just that, I mean, there were foreign invaders and there was a multicultural cosmopolitan factor and there was a Talmudic factor, absolutely, at the leadership. But without Russian collaboration, it wouldn't have been possible. And yet, what are we doing about it now besides writing weird, censored history books? And so at the moment, Russia is not really dealing with the problem of the revolution appropriately. If anything, the Bolshevik idea is being swept under the rug. The issues that Russia has brought on itself back then, at least not Russia, but the Russian people, it hasn't been dealt with. There is no collective repentance. And I do need to emphasize this. Collective repentance is a real thing. We see it in the Old Testament with the prophets traveling to various cities, warning them about a potential collective punishment by God if there is no repentance. Nineveh is the greatest example of this. The city was saved because they listened to a prophet of God. And the Assyrian people, the Nineveh was their capital at the time, they repented. In Russian history, during the War of 1612, which obviously was a huge civil conflict, but in particular, Russia was at war with Poland, you can almost say. The Russian people had a 3-day fast of no food, no water at all. It was a 3-day hard fast and intense prayer collectively in order for God to forgive them so that the civil war and the invasion of Poland would end. So there were key periods in Russian history when the Russian people, led by their higher clergy, would turn to God and ask him for forgiveness. That hasn't happened yet since 1917. Well, it has happened in certain isolated places, like the Pryamorsky Zemsky Sobor, which is this council of Russian-based people at the end of the Civil War in far eastern Siberia. But there was a few hundred people, maybe a few thousand, who actually participated in that collective prayer service. There has been no President Putin, nor President Yeltsin, nor President Medvedev, nor Gorbachev, nor any other leader has called to a collective repentance for the sin of betraying their Tsar in 1917, and also collective apostasy for turning Russia into a communist hellhole. So, and that is very significant, because I think that's one of the great stumbling blocks, in the way of Russian rejuvenation and Russian rebirth. Notice, obviously, the Russian Spring. We spoke about Russia becoming stronger again, but it feels like something is missing here, and I think one of those elements is accountability before Christ, and that is an ancient Christian tradition, obviously ancient biblical tradition going back to the Old Testament. The Byzantine Romans also had traditions of mass repentance. Many, many times they gathered together and they prayed to God for forgiveness, and God saved Constantinople many a times during many different sieges and battles. In Russia, unfortunately, they're not hearkening back to those ancient ideals. Instead, they're following, whatever the trend is at the moment. Realpolitik will save us. Realism will save us, when in fact we know that's not the case, because the powers of the world, as we can see today, as they're bombing Iran, are very, very powerful. They, materially speaking, they are preeminent in this world. I mean, it's what Russia felt during the Crimean War, when 3 world empires attacked Russia at the same time. It's the same thing now. Russia today is not as strong as it used to be, far from it. And so we just need to keep this consideration open, is that, repentance is still available. And that's probably the optimal point, is that the Bolshevik Revolution, it's a historic event, but one which hasn't been overcome, and the poisonous fruits of which have not been properly, expelled out of the Russian national organism. They are still festering here. And so, and I don't mean that because of this people of a certain tribe running things. That's one element of it. There is the cultural and the religious side of it as well, Welsh, which I'm sure you can appreciate, having listened to the show and being a member of the community. There's a lot of work to be done. And so I think part of that I'm contributing to by even running the show, or maybe doing things like this interview.
That sounds good. Dmitry, you can hear me all right, correct?
Sounds good, yeah.
Yeah. That is a brilliant summary of that revolution and how horrible it was. Dmitry, do you remember an article I showed you on the Discord called "This is by Death to the World"? They're a very good, Orthodox Christian news outlet. And it was the article, do you remember that? It was the cosmic significance of Sir Nicholas II. Do you remember that, Dmitry?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah. There's a girl called, by the way, shout out to this girl called Red X Volume. Shout out to her. She did an absolutely fantastic video of talking about the Russian Revolution and stuff, and talking about this article. And me and her, I had her on my show. We spoke about this. And during reading that article, this is a quote from this article. Sorry if I'm just trying to put this specific bit. I don't want to put just trying to keep it simple. But it says here, through all the ups and downs of history, the principle is evident in the times, even in the times of imperfect, spiritual starving of both Byzantium and Holy Russia, temporarily earthly authority, has had an important role to guide people to the eternal and heavenly kingdom. The modern secular idea of government is based on Enlightenment and ideology, its subsequent evolution into revolutionary mindset. For example, the granddaddy of modern revolutions, the French Revolution, made no attempt to hide the fact of desire to overthrow the throne and the altar. So that article points out how the French Revolution also, you can say, has a connection to the Russian Revolution. And how, so when you hear that wording and you hear that type of wording, what is your opinion towards that?
Look, I think it's correct, and it's also one of the reasons why even the word revolution, at least to my ears, somebody who's grown up in Orthodoxy, it's quite a poisonous term, even though it can have some neutrality. And obviously, for example, in the Iranian context, it means one thing, whilst in France it could mean an entirely other connotation. And obviously, in Russia, revolution is something quite negative, at least to me. It's either the liberal Masonic Revolution of March, February 1917, or it's the Bolshevik Revolution. Both of them toxic and evil, and in some ways, intimately related as well. It's I think incorrect to say that these two revolutions were somehow separate events. They are very closely monitored and linked together by participants and collaborators from both sides. The Freemasons and the Bolsheviks worked together, is what I'm trying to say. They weren't as different as many people suspect, but I think, generally speaking, the removal of Orthodox as well as just generally Christian monarchy, as well as the power of royalty from Europe, has been the objective, for whatever reason, of certain revolutionary circles, and they, of course, led by Enlightenment, heavily Masonized ideas. Sadly, I think partially you can see the American example, 1776, the revolt against King George III, for example. Even though King George III was already living and operating in a Rothschild infused England, and England was far from its, the British Empire was far from ideal, the very notion of having to revolt against kingship via this, following these ideals set out by secular revolutionaries or Freemasons, is in and of itself like a philosophically non-European and non-Christian. And I agree with this girl who I'd like to either listen to or watch her analysis later of this article. But the article is perfect, Welsh, because it basically tries to clarify directly what the main concern of these revolutionaries was. In France, it was the murder of King Louis and his wife, Marie Antoinette, and his entire family, and their torture as well ahead of time. And obviously, there were, notice, Roman Catholicism. Where did Christianity in France go after the revolution? Well, we know, into apostasy. The whole country basically began falling apart at the seams. French culture became degenerate. Then, of course, people like, in our modern day age, we have, Brunel, Epstein living in France, molesting children. So that's where it basically went, culturally speaking. But very interesting. Obviously, I think the two revolutions are linked. I will write about this in my upcoming chapters of Ritual Regicide, which we're still working on our Substack. So there will be a chapter about the French Revolution and how there are occult symbolisms even in that particular revolution, because you'd think that was purely the French people rising up against the tyrannical King Louis, and the French economy was doing bad and all this other garbage. But as we now understand, most of these revolutions are just like the colored revolutions in the Middle East and other places, controlled, and obviously controlled by whom? Main question we need to ask these days. And generally, look, the article, I think, obviously focuses on the figure of the Emperor, the Tsar, Nicholas II, the katechon, right? Удерживающий. This idea of the katechon gets abused quite a bit, but I would say the article doesn't do that. The idea of the restrainer, the katechon, is an idea that, of course, I think is defined most aptly by Saint John Chrysostom, right? As he's providing commentary on the Second Thessalonians, chapter 2, verse 6. So if you read that particular Bible verse, you'll see very clearly it's quite mysterious. It doesn't actually give you a defined. Apostle Paul is very mysterious about what he means. But if you look at the exegesis of it from Saint John Chrysostom, from even one of the recent Russian church fathers, Saint Theophan Saint Theophan the Recluse, for example, you'll see that this particular verse from Saint Paul, it specifically is talking about the imperial authority of Rome holding back the Antichrist. It's very interesting because that obviously didn't make sense to early Christians, at least probably many of the normie Christians of the day. but the saints certainly understood this. It's an interesting concept because essentially what it states is, as long as there is a Roman slash Christian, and obviously these two things become synonyms after Saint Constantine, obviously converts to Christianity. As long as there is a Roman Christian power in the world, and there is an emperor, that is a Tsar, there the Antichrist will not rule from the third temple. He will not come to power. And if he does, the role of the restrainer will be to essentially provide opposition to him so that people do not follow the Antichrist, at least protect the Orthodox Christians from him. This idea was mainstream during the Byzantine Roman Empire. In fact, because they physically, think about it, during St. Justinian's time, they physically controlled the city of Jerusalem itself. Just St. Justinian built the medieval walls you see around Jerusalem today. Some of them date back to St. Justinian's time and the architecture of the 6th century AD. Orthodox Christians had no illusions about the Antichrist coming to power in the future, but as long as they controlled certain parts of the world, as long as they were in power and they kept the world headed towards Christ and not towards the Antichrist, it would be protected. And by they, I mean, obviously the Tsar is the leader of the entire thing. It is really, I think people need to really understand, it is well and truly about autocratic power. The emperor, the Tsar, that figure is very key to the entire Katechon concept. People try to today portray Russia as a country, as this collective Katechon led by United Russia with Vladimir Putin or Mishustin or whomever is, the prime minister or president in power. There is no concept of that. And I mean, St. John of Kronstadt defines it very clearly for us. He says, Russia without a Tsar is it's like a body without a head, which means it's a corpse. So Russia today, according to the words of St. John of Kronstadt, is a corpse and it's rotting without a Tsar. The other, for example, saints have also spoken about the need for Russia to return to monarchy, because that return to a katechon will prevent certain events from taking place, in my opinion. Like, if the Lord wills it, the end of the world in and of itself, including the reigning of the Moshiach that the Netanyahu and friends want to bring to power. That is why Welsh, and I think many listeners can appreciate, and future listeners to this space, as it is being recorded, just this one thing, if you can take away, just focus on this. In terms of Orthodox Christianity, the one idea which people oppose the most, in terms of people outside of the church, even certain liberals within the church, the one concept, one element of the faith, the one, I would say, important piece of church tradition that is the most despised, surprisingly, is the idea of an Orthodox monarchy. In Russia and abroad, specifically in the Russian Federation today, you have liberals, left-wing, even some center-right-wing people opposing the idea of an Orthodox monarchy for these exact... I mean, they don't even give a rationale to it. It's almost as if it's demonic. In particular, you speak about Tsar Nicholas II, and people start, salivating, people start, having these demonic convulsions, etc. It's completely insane. And I think the idea of a katechon, many misinterpret it. They claim, it's this collective idea. No, the katechon is the imperial authority, but imperial authority of whether it's the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, or the Russian Empire, the Third Rome, with its capital either in Petrograd or in Moscow, is personified by the figure of the Tsar and the Emperor. That is key to it all. And I think many do not appreciate that, which means today there is no personified katechon, which means that the Antichrist is welcome to come to power. And that's why we see what we see in the Middle East, etc., and elsewhere. And why Chabad Lubavitch is running rampant in Russia, and why Donald J. Trump is wearing a kippah, and why there are Americans dying in the Middle East. And obviously the Al-Aqsa Mosque is on the chopping block for being blown up, clearly to make way for not Christian architecture and real estate building, but for the third temple. So we are, in a way, living in an apocalyptic time simply for one reason only, and that is because the majority Orthodox Christian country, Russia, deposed its own emperor by listening to the whisperers of some very devious and evil people. So yeah, hopefully that somewhat addressed the question, Welsh, but feel free to send me that video or article by this lady who analyzed the text. I'd like to hear her opinion as well. I mean, it's interesting because the article itself, it's on its own. It's amazing. There's no denying that, but it's very important. I think a lot of people, maybe from certain Eurasianist circles, they do misinterpret the catechonic concept. It's not in line with what Saint Theophan the Recluse wrote. It's not in turn what Saint John of Chrysostom spoke about, nor Saint John of Kronstadt, nor even obviously our own American Saint John Maximovich of Shanghai and San Francisco, right? When he mentioned that Russia is the third Rome and that the Russian people committed a grave sin by allowing for their Tsar to be killed, and some of them even participating in his murder. Like, I mean, this is really loaded stuff in terms of content, but I think it needs to be said because it is very heavy, and it weighs, I think, heavy on most Christians because it is an unresolved problem in our particular reality. Notice we're not at the helm or in a particular time when there is rampant heresy or the church is in need of an ecumenical council to discuss a certain issue. But the crisis of our time today, of the 21st century, is the fact that we do not have an Orthodox Christian Tsar and Emperor anywhere in the world. That is the number one problem that we have today. And yes, some people will literally chimp out if they hear me say that, but nobody's willing to, obviously, no one is able to debate this point. So 1917, 1918, the murder of Tsar Nicholas II and his family had cosmic, global significance to the entirety of mankind, because God's anointed one was ritually murdered, and his own Orthodox Christian subjects didn't save him. That's a big problem. And look at us now, happy-go-lucky, we're just going about our lives, not caring about the consequences of that. And evil people now rule the world. So, yeah, it's domino effect.
Dmitry, I remember a long time ago you did a fantastic post saying why Sir Nicholas why Tsar Nicholas II, sorry if I butchered that, was the greatest leader of the 20th century. Can you please tell me why in that post why he was the greatest leader of the 20th century, and what was so great about the Russian Empire society that you won't hear from anything from the history books? Go.
Well, I think firstly, Russian society was very, how do I even describe it in English? Because I have the Russian in my head, but it was very rapidly developing in terms of its population was growing at such speeds that we don't even see African countries doing at this point, right? So this even alongside being a leader of the top five economy in the whole world, developing alongside massive giants which had global empires. Think about it, colonial empires, those which had insane industrial bases like the young United States, obviously France, Germany, which was just freshly united, literally a new state has just appeared in Europe, and the British Empire, essentially the largest empire in the world. Russia being amongst these top four, top five countries, whilst also industrializing and strengthening itself, and obviously technologizing and inventing things. At the same time, it had a huge population growth, the largest population growth. Majority, of course, of the so-called the White Russians, the Great Russian Velikorussy people, the small Russians, the what now we call Ukrainians, but Malorossi, and the White Russians. Their populations grew the most, but also the populations of other native Russian peoples and peoples who populated Russia, generally speaking, the various native tribes, etc. Their populations grew insanely large to the point where I think this is the neutral number we can give from the beginning of Tsar Nicholas II's reign in 1896 until the beginning of the revolution, 1917. That is 21 years. The population grew by 55 million, which is insane. This is before the invention of penicillin and antibiotics, which means there was still a very large percentage in every single country of births that either led to either the death of the mother or the infant child would pass away simply from infection, cold. Before antibiotics, things were rough. Infections would they could just one-shot you. Now, obviously, with the invention of modern medicine, and antibiotics only came into being, penicillin, I believe, 1930s, if I'm not mistaken. or like the late 1920s. So even prior to that, the Russian population the birth rate was something like 7.6, just 7.6 births per woman on average across the entire empire. But that's not the only achievement. Obviously, other things, electrification of cities at rapid rates. Various cities which were so far away from Europe, like the distance would be as if from France to, for example, Poland. Cities in far western Siberia would receive electricity. The great railway projects, construction of railway lines, construction of chemical factories for things like, obviously, everything from early versions of pesticides for farming. Farming technologies were improving to uh, pure gunpowder and other chemicals used in warfare, for example, explosive chemicals, things like that. All of these various factories, the country was, I mean, in terms of airplanes as well, the inventor of the Black Hawk helicopter, obviously Igor Sikorsky, was born in Russia and he was inventing planes in Russia during the First World War. So the Black Hawk helicopter could have been a Russian helicopter if the revolution didn't happen. That's just one example. So Russia was leading the world in many places, but it was also competing and staying on par with some of the leading economies in the world, many of which had, or you can almost say, artificial assistance. And in some ways, I think America's a good example. The American people were incredibly hardworking, but it appears that the Talmudic banking capital already chose America in the late 1800s, I believe, at the earliest, to the early 1900s, around the sinking of the Titanic, to become the next iteration of this British Empire, the servant of the Talmudic tribe. And of course, they began corrupting America and its culture soon thereafter. But that's not to say that Russia didn't have all these various other economic achievements. Economic achievements are just one thing, right? I think consider the fact that the the religious cultural building, of, for example, Russia had a really interesting cultural trend wherein you had Orthodox priests uh, catechizing and teaching young students in uh, what you would call maybe like junior schools, like primary school education, from roughly year one until year five or so. So you would have most people in the country, 80% of the population, would go to a school wherein the majority of the teachers were actually Orthodox Christian priests, and they were paid a salary by the state, and they were raised with inherent Christian values, so they perhaps would not fall away from the faith. And I think it was something like 10,000 schools were built per year in the Russian Empire. 10,000 schools sounds like a lot, but it doesn't actually, it doesn't unfortunately meet the quota of a population growth of 55 million over 21 years. You would need many more schools to be built every single year. In any case, the country was well and truly, first class in the world among all the other great world powers. And in some capacity, just going back to your question, I think it's really curious how the Tsar Nicholas II, his responsibility for it all, like he was leading Russian expansion in economics, in world affairs, in foreign policy. He was leading Russia correctly and trying to avoid foreign conflicts in terms of the First World War, the Russo-Japanese War, when the Koreyets and the Varyag, the two Russian ships, was attacked by surprise by the Japanese, and that commenced the Russo-Japanese War. Or when Germany declared war on Russia and invaded the Russian Empire during World War One. Tsar Nicholas II didn't actually start any conflicts. He tried to be a world peacekeeper. Despite all of the pressure from the international community, and people can fact check this, he kept the Pale of Settlement active as a place of isolation of certain toxic elements of Russian society. As you can guess, members of the Talmudic tribe were kept in isolation, away from, obviously, away from the greater Russian population and people, far in the west. Which, mind you, they had as much. I believe they could live on land, broadly speaking, Welsh, the size of 4 or 5 Israels. So, just for reference, it's not like they were given a small strip of land to live on. They had, uh, you know, as much land as certain entire countries of Europe to live on, but they couldn't settle in other places of Russia. And the Pale of Settlement as an isolationist project. You can say almost an apartheid type project was kept alive by Tsar Nicholas II for those exact positive results. So, despite all the claims that he was a weak ruler, in fact, we don't see that weakness in terms of him actually bowing down to international pressure. At least in what comes to when it comes to the Talmudic question. There's other, of course, like positive things to note, but the reason why he was also probably the most successful ruler, the greatest ruler of the 20th century, is because his keen religious understanding of Russian culture, of world affairs, is just the understanding that he needed to lead his country and set an example for all the people, including having a large family himself, being a pious Orthodox Christian, being very smart and bright. He was always an avid learner. He would read books, always educate himself. He was preparing himself to become the Tsar from a very young age. This is someone who is, I wouldn't say a perfectionist, but someone who is very, very close to being the perfect Christian ruler in every single aspect. In my opinion, he would have probably been canonized as a saint, even if Tsar Nicholas II wasn't martyred by the Bolsheviks. And the more I read about him over the years, the more I'm coming to this conclusion that him, his wife, Saint Alexandra, the Empress of Russia, and their children, they well and truly lived a very angelic life whilst leading such a complicated country, like a complex nation of 170 plus million people with very complicated borders. And mind you, a lot of people don't appreciate. They're saying, well, why was Russian development always so stunted and a little bit behind, say, certain colonial empires of the West? Well, the truth is, Russia, unlike the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, which inherited a lot of its wealth from its, well, you can say its pagan progeny, right? The first Rome as we saw it during the early centuries, which inherited huge wealth, gold mines, diamond mines, all, I mean, not diamonds, but gem mines of various sorts, all essentially full treasuries. Constantinople, the fact that the city from its very inception did not fall to the enemies for a solid 900 years after its founding, until the Crusaders took it in 1204 AD. Um, the second and the first Rome were incredibly wealthy, but for Russia, Russia always had an issue with natural resources. European Russia, although today we look at the Donbass and we say, well, they have coal, natural gas, there's even a little bit of uranium, other minerals available. All these minerals only become useful during the industrial age. Early on, there were no areas of Western European Russia prior to the Ural Mountains. So before you reach Siberia, essentially in central Russia, none of these areas had any steel. There was no metallurgy. Like Russia needed to always buy this. The Russians needed to buy their swords, spears, armor, and weapons from neighboring countries. Can you imagine? So Russians actually couldn't develop weapons on their own. They needed to purchase them from their neighbors. So Russia always had an issue with border control in terms of you had Islamic invaders from the south, you had Western expansionists in the west, including Lithuanians, various pagan tribes like the early Estonians. You had Roman Catholic crusaders, even the Teutonic Knights, and of course the very aggressive Roman Catholic Polish, who were somewhat related to Russians by their ancestry, and both of us are of course Slavic peoples, but they are very much rivals historically and culturally speaking, and they wanted to at times smother their much, I would say, much less powerful neighbor to the east, which was the young Russian country, right? And so Russia was never a wealthy country, literally until I would say the perhaps early 20th century. And the reign of Tsar Nicholas II is the first time during the very industrialized period that you can start to see the natural wealth of Siberia, the natural wealth of Russia really come into play and start to play a role in the lives of the regular Russian folks who began working in factories. They began to use natural resources, turn crude oil into kerosene and other things. And you don't actually see this in earlier centuries. Prior to that, Russians needed to produce, they needed to farm, they needed to gather other resources which were popular in other nations that they could sell to, and then, of course, barter and exchange things. So the way the Russian economy ran was incredibly difficult in centuries past. And so Russia had a very long journey towards the position it's in today, when it could literally just sell crude oil and just raw gas or LNG to various countries, whether it's in Asia or Europe, and make a few quick American dollars with no effort whatsoever. That isn't the historic Russian reality even prior to Tsar Nicholas II. So the fact that he managed this growth so efficiently and effectively, even during the First World War, which was the largest war in human history at that point, just kind of shows that he already, whilst remaining an Orthodox Christian, whilst canonizing saints, opening churches, what more could you really ask for?
That is a great summary. Absolutely brilliant, Dmitry. Dmitry, I want to ask you two more questions. Is that okay? Two more questions? That
Yeah,
will
go
work with
ahead.
you? Yeah. So, as we all know, of course, the the Israel Iran war, of course, is happening right now. Of course, we all know it's for the Greater Israel Project. It's to build the third temple, and as we all know, that. With that happening, how do you see that war playing out? And you and Conrad talk about Turkey and Greece potentially getting into a conflict, and of course, how this could be a part of the greater Middle Eastern regional crisis. How do you see the Israel Iran war playing out, and how will exactly the Greek Turkic war come into play? And what's the prophecies behind that? Go. And also the leader of Turkey. What role does he have to play? Egragon. Sorry if I get his pronunciation wrong. Go.
Yeah, there are certain prophecies coming from Greek elders and saints, Welsh, that speak of the time after this president of Turkey today, Erdogan, falls. His opposition is very, I would say, different in that they are a more aggressive Turkic, Kemalist, secular form of. Well, you can say Erdogan is also a Turkish supremacist, but they are a very different kind. They're the type of Turkic supremacists that brought around the genocide of the Armenians, the Pontic Greeks, and other minorities within Turkey itself. So it's very interesting. Some of the prophets of the Greek Orthodox Church, the clairvoyant elders and saints, they speak of this clash between Greece and Turkey after Erdogan is ousted from power or after he passes away. And I think that's very true because Erdogan, he only won his election with a very brief margin. Turkish society is very it's convulsing, really. You can say politically speaking, it's Turks don't really know what they want collectively. Like it's obviously Turkey since the Kemalist, since the Ataturk revolution, has always been a very secular, aggressive nation, similar to Israel. You can say. I mean, Turkey really is only 25, roughly years younger than Israel is, so it has the same sort of Turkic Zionist aspirations. A lot of these Middle Eastern countries are, in fact, quite young in terms of, they're really based on these weird nationalist, quasi Enlightenment ideals. But in particular, I think the war right now in the Middle East clearly it's to establish an Israeli Lebensraum of sorts in the Middle East, to establish the future living space for the Talmudic Jewish Zionist people in the Middle East, whether it's further out into Iraq and Syria. And obviously, Syria has already been somewhat prepared for Israeli expansion, as has Lebanon. Syria, in particular, the Syrian civil war, which I think all of us need to study the fruits of. Specifically, I think what's interesting is Russian participation in all of this. But we know the Greater Israel Project is preparation for that construction of the future apocalyptic, reigning kingdom of the Antichrist, the Moshiach, who will come from the tribe of Dan. He'll be born to a Talmudic whore from that particular tribe specifically, almost the opposite of the Virgin Mary, the Mother of God. And there's other prophecies that speak as to who this particular Antichrist person will be, but he certainly will be a circumcised member of the tribe, 100%. And to prepare their country for him, for their Lord, they need to make sure they are safe. And that is why they are not just killing the native population and murdering them and sacrificing them to Baal, and I mean exploding, burning them alive in these huge fires. And obviously, as we saw in Gaza, they would burn these entire tent cities, and of course, many children would perish in them. I mean, all of this has really interesting symbolism because even obviously the name of Palestine itself, I mean, it just harkens back to a very ancient time. But I don't want to get into the details of things. The point is that we know what the goals are of this particular tribe. It's not secular at all. Netanyahu comes from a long lineage of Talmudic rabbis. He himself, the reason I think so much power was given to him, and he may even be dead as we speak, The point is, he was given this particular position of power and this authority in order to carry out the will of these, elders. I would say, the elders who are in the protocols, the elders of Zion, to prepare their country for the birth of this child, or perhaps if the child is already born, for the time when he grows up, and perhaps at the age of 30 or 31, similar, mimicking Christ, he'll come to power in this particular country. And this is why, obviously, Trump even recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel is a preparation for that same third temple construction and other things that, again, is sadly the evangelical Zionists and the Trump administration have been preparing America for. Like, this is all speaks to this third temple project and this apocalyptic future kingdom of the Antichrist, Moshiach, their Messiah that they're waiting for, right? The thing is, sadly, for the Middle East, I think there's a true issue going on between the Greeks and the Turks. It's clearly historic because the Greek people being oppressed during the Turkish yoke, oppressed by Islam, they've had their fill. But I think one thing that's really interesting is, in some ways, although there are many saints and Greek heroes associated with the revolution and the entire Greek revival of the 19th century, Greece liberating itself from Islam and the Turkish yoke, we have to just keep in mind, I believe there was one particular country which tried to, and obviously through, not figures like Lord Byron, right, but obviously through the British fleet, for attempting to subjugate the Greek Revolution, which was Orthodox at its very beginning and had, there were obviously Masonic roots to it, but there was also an Orthodox element. They tried to turn the energy and the will of the Hellenic people towards constructing something far away from an ideal. And so Greece, I think, has a huge internal challenge in trying to address its inherent flaws that were built, almost like baked into the cake in the 19th century. That is Freemasonry, liberalism, these Enlightenment ideas, which, frankly, although they had relevance, I mean, look, we can't even, look, the Enlightenment ideals were not real even in the 4th century BC or the 5th century of BC when Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle lived in ancient Athens and other places around Greece. Like, that ancient Greece is long gone, and to pretend that modern day Hellenes are anything like those the democratic ancient ancestors is just completely wrong and incorrect, because many places in Greece had kings. Macedon, for example, Sparta had 2 kings. There's a clear tradition in Greece of variety of political administration. And yet, notice Greece, they're trying to portray it as the motherland of democracy, liberalism, degeneracy, etc. And that's a very bad precedent to start from. But here's the issue. If Greece doesn't necessarily wake up soon, it will be used as a battering ram of slaughtering Orthodox Christians in the Eastern Mediterranean against this rising, very, again, also highly energetic, very nationalistic, and very confused Turkish majority. It's similar to how modern day Russians and Ukrainians are killing one another, whilst the overall goals of the special military operation are quite vague and ambiguous to us. The same thing will happen in this future special military operation of sorts between Greece and Turkey. And this is why some of the prophecies, they kind of come around with vague outcomes. For example, Russia attacking Turkey from the north and then handing over Constantinople, Istanbul to the Greeks. We have questions, right? Such as, so what will happen exactly? Constantinople, a city which never knew democracy, which was always ruled by an imperial autocrat, which could only be compared to literally Adolf Hitler by today's standards. Like the Byzantine emperor, just for reference, this is how far away the modern Greek political ideal is to the Byzantine Empire, which it should be honestly mimicking and referring to. In the Eastern Roman Empire in Byzantium, when you would come into the presence of the Tsar, of the Basileus, the emperor, you would have to fall onto the ground and do a full prostration on the floor. Now, I don't know if the modern day Greek is ready to do that, or ready to respect, monarchist authority, or the authority of the God-anointed emperor. I think they've been brainwashed into going to voting booths, into, appreciating the fruits of liberal democracy, of the European Union, and other things, which is quite sad. So what I'm trying to say is, I think the future war between Russia, Turkey, and Greece, and obviously the dissolution of NATO, Welsh, it could well and truly be, I think, in some way related to this future very ambiguous special military operation that may in fact result. One of the benefits of this confusing war that the prophecies speak of could be the Greeks reacquiring Constantinople and consecrating Hagia Sophia and returning back to the ancient city. But, and this is the big but with capital B, right? Think about this. What's the point of Constantinople without an emperor, without a basileus inside of it? It's a barren womb. It's a desolate city. Hagia Sophia, the cathedral, is built to have imperial liturgies in, of the emperor partaking in communion. There was never a time in the history of Constantinople that the Hagia Sophia had liturgies without the emperor present. At least, obviously the emperors traveled around, but what I'm saying is Constantinople is an imperial city. It is not a democratic city. So I do wonder what St. Paisios, for example, foresaw in that future, or what perhaps maybe the Lord will be sending the Greeks a message with the state modern Greece is in, with the acquisition of the holy city of Constantinople and the liberation of Istanbul. Perhaps the Greeks will experience a political enlightenment themselves. That is, they will return back to what they were supposed to be, that is, monarchists, right from the very beginning, back to their actual Byzantine ideals. It's all well and good to claim to be inheritors of the Eastern Roman Empire, but if you aren't a Greek monarchist, that is pointless, because it was Constantine who built the city. It wasn't the Greek people. It was the will of a monarch who built that city on the ancient town of Byzantium where it was located. It wasn't the collective will or the national aspiration. It wasn't all of that nonsense. It was one person who received the vision from God. So we have to it's a big reality check. So perhaps the clairvoyant foretellings of St. Paisios are correct in that maybe God will allow the Russians to fight for some dubious reason with the Turks. And in that war, many ancient Greek lands will return back to the Greek people. And that will be, in a way, almost like a reflection. Maybe then Greece will begin enlightening itself. So, in fact, the war, it could be, for example, a Masonic Greek government fighting the Kemalist Muslim Brotherhood Turkey. I'm not saying the Greeks would be the bad guys here, but they will be far from the heroes of old that we used to read about. This won't be an Orthodox Greece fighting Turkey. It'll be a Masonic, a Freemason-led Greece, probably protected and defended by certain elements of the EU, fighting against the Kemalist Muslim Brotherhood-led Turkey. One of these two countries will be supported by Israel, there's no doubt, and obviously the Russian Federation, which I think when this attack on Turkey will take place, like, Lord forbid, you know, Russia will attack Turkey because of its aggression against Israel. I really do hope Russia never becomes an ally of Israel in the Middle East. Now, I know there is a possibility of that. Some listeners may think this is absurd, but if you just listen to what the Russian leaders are saying, or have been saying for a while in Syria, in relation to the current Iran-Israeli war, there are real concerns about Russia actually allying with Israel against a future aggressive Turkey. Huge concerns. And obviously, Greece will join into that triumvirate, this sort of almost like a trilateral union against the Turks. And yes, that may bring about, even though this union will be built on Chabad Lubavitch and the rule of like circumcised elders of Zion, it won't be a good alliance. It's an alliance built on falsehood and basically predatory aspirations towards Turkey. God can make even positive things come out of evil projects. We have to keep this in mind. This has happened throughout history. So even the aspirations of evil elites, whether it's in Russia, Greece, and Israel combined, against predatory and Islamic extremists in Turkey, in Ankara and Istanbul, God can make something good come out of that as well. So I think on one hand, we always have this reading of those prophecies between NATO falling apart, Greece and Turkey fighting, which will happen, and Russia will join in. We have one reading where we imagine the Marble Emperor already awakening and ruling the Greek people, and we imagine Russia having the future promised, as they say, the Tsar who will come in the future, that future Tsar ruling Russia and going south to liberate ancient Greek Orthodox Christian lands. Whilst that is a possibility, I think we also, especially today, in light of current events in the Middle East, the other possibility, which also includes the Greeks obtaining and liberating Istanbul, Constantinople, it may include, say, a very different sort of war, a much more confusing one, similar to the Second World War, which also involved huge territories being swapped around and shuffled. And yet, can we truly say who the good guys were in the Second World War? I mean, it is very difficult. I know many listeners probably lean in one or the other direction, but in terms of there wasn't a single country that was, in majority speaking, pushing Christian values. Everyone was in one way or another essentially working off of secular or weird 20th century ideologies. It was a very different war, the Second World War, when compared to the first, which was the First World War was quite standard and, in fact, in some ways very proper and logical. The second one, not so much. And the Third World War, especially when Russia, Greece, and Turkey are involved, might be just as confusing with certain bad characters running around. But I'm hoping, look, I'm hoping it happens sooner rather than later so we can frankly move on with things. And hopefully the people, I mean, because the war will happen. It is inevitable. We can see the aggression of the Greeks against the Turks and vice versa. We can see the Russians obviously being led against the Ukrainians for some reason, not exactly conducting the war in a proper fashion. Even in even when you compare the Russian military doctrine today to that of the Second World War, it is very strange. It is well and truly, as they say, a military operation of sorts. So I think Welsh, very long-winded answer, but I think it's my view of what will happen is I think I stand at the moment, I'm leaning towards the future war against the Turks between the Russians, the Greeks, and potentially even the Israelis, who even at the moment are signaling that they wish to destroy Turkey, and they say Turkey is along with Qatar, it's the home of the Muslim Brotherhood, it's the rising enemy after Iran, etc. They're almost preparing us mentally for this future conflict, and I do see this also with the Third World War as this imperfect, confusing war, but one which God may use to again enlighten the Greeks, bring them back to the faith and to a true understanding of what they should be politically. And hopefully for the Russians, it will also be a huge sobering wake-up call. Because clearly this war in Ukraine is not, I mean, as much as it is producing many Orthodox Christians, and it is in some ways creating a patriotic renaissance in Russia, we do have to keep in mind, like it isn't actually hitting the big cities as effectively as we believe. St. Petersburg, Moscow, there are still people going clubbing, hanging out during Great Lent, just producing degeneracy. People on TikTok still, people haven't realized that the country has been at war for 4 years. It's very strange in a lot of big cities around Russia. So the real wake up call, it appears, hasn't come yet. And so I think God will probably provide. And so, Lord, have mercy on both the Russian and the Greek people, because I think inevitably they will become almost as involved as the Iranians are today. Sadly, I think that time will be very soon.
Very brilliant analysis. Conrad, I just wanted to point out, so speaking of that, as we all know, many people are saying now we're going to go to America. This is the last question I want to ask you. As we all know, with how the world is going forward, a lot of people say China, because America, as we all know, as of course, it's not really America. It's the United States of Israel. It's been that way since 1913. You could argue since 1871, whatever. That's another thing. But you can argue that, with America dying and it going downhill, and how they're losing the war with Iran at the moment, which they are, even though Iran is suffering great loss, but Iran is still winning in a way because they're bombing all the bases and the United States being humiliated. And if they do a ground invasion, it will be freaking stupid because America will get annihilated, will get just embarrassed. They won't get annihilated, but they'll get embarrassed. Same with Israel and how that's not going well. With that, how that's going, and how BRICS is rising and how China will become the world superpower. And I also believe, Conrad, I'm just going to give an opinion here. I believe Russia, as America declines, China will become the world superpower, which will be good. And I believe Russia will become the second world superpower. Putin is great, but I do believe Russia do need another. So I do believe after Putin, because he did free Russia from the globalist elite, not entirely, you can disagree on that, which is fine. But entirely, though, going forward, Russia will become the world's second superpower. But the question is, I wanted to ask you, Conrad, as China's growing and Russia becomes the world's second superpower, etc., etc., this is probably before the Turkey-Greece war. As America's falling, Conrad, a lot of people say America's going to have an economic collapse. A lot of people say this. There are some people who are saying it's going to go to a civil war. There, shout out to my friend Heidi and also a guy called Godfrey. He's been talking about the potential of America going to martial law where, you know, blah, blah, blah. People get, like, America goes to martial law, whatever, and all of that stuff. And a civil war breaks up, like Trump declares martial law, and maybe a secession happens and the globalist elite basically start a civil war from there. Conrad, in your opinion, what do you think is going to happen to America? As we all know, it's on the side. What do you think is going to happen to America? Do you see it just collapsing into a third world, fourth world dump? Or do you see the elite? I mean, which, of course, they're planning to ditch America for Pax Judaica, which is, you know, making Israel the next superpower, which is a part of it. How do you see America falling? Do you think it's going to collapse, like into a third world dump, like into a financial collapse, or do you see it entering into a civil war? And if it does enter into a civil war, what type of civil war do you think it will be? Go.
Well, that's really tough. But as I said earlier, like, America does have a huge contention between their various populations. And that, I mean, the liberals and the conservatives, there's a huge rift that's been almost not artificially created, but like the rift is there. Like, left-wing and right-wing people are inherently different, and the contentions are very serious. For example, left-wing people literally want to abort babies and, you know, make young people into members of the alphabet community. That's already incredibly egregious and criminal. So nobody can agree with that if you're on the right. That's already civil war worthy material. Now, I think obviously creating, or at least in a way fostering, a left wing in America, obviously from even prior to the Obama years, birthing this degenerate left wing movement in America, they've been preparing to set it as this wild beast against the remaining conservatives and the right wingers in America. They've been preparing. I mean, it's not yet, the fruits of the American revolt are not yet ripe. I think if there will be local revolutions and civil unrest in America, they will probably emerge also from the factor of migration. A lot of the so-called Roman Catholic South Americans and Central Americans moving into North America, into the United States, are not as Roman Catholic and conservative as you'd like them to be. Sadly, there's, even though, you know, there's clear issues, there's obviously the issue of multicultural crime in many American cities. The primary factor, although I think Welsh, and this will determine how long the elites allow America to remain relatively artificially peaceful, is it's a utilitarian consideration. So they're using America just as they used the British Empire for as long as they needed until they could discard the host. And for now, America, look how useful it is. I mean, they're using it to destroy Iran before our very eyes, killing Iranian leaders. They're quite happy, I think, to use America for another few decades at the very least, obviously accumulating a huge artificial debt, which somehow doesn't crash the economy. And it's all, notice, the country's economy is literally on life support, and yet it continues to live. The host continues to live because the parasite is feeding it and keeping it alive. And they will eventually leave the host, but in order for them to leave, they need a new home somewhere, whether it's in China or perhaps, and look, I don't necessarily agree with the Chinese hypothesis. I think Pax Judaica is a more realistic idea. So they do need several decades to build up this new Greater Israel project in the Middle East before they can make the complete jump and leave the Anglo-Saxon West, which they have basically infested for the last, at least since the Great British Revolution, or Great English Revolution, as they call it, or whatever the true name is of the Talmudic takeover of Albion, right? So
Yeah.
It's incredibly concerning that I think Americans don't realize that eventually they will be abandoned, their economy will be in shambles, and they will have to declare bankruptcy because of that $40 trillion debt that these people have built up, and their ship.
It's now 39
39,
trillion.
yeah. So
39.
it's basically they're at the doorstep of an unpayable debt, and so they're still using America. I think well and truly it is that it's in a zombie-like state, but it's a powerful zombie, and that's the saddest part. Is culturally speaking, it is decaying, but they're allowing it to remain in somewhat a composite position so that it can carry on the will of their masters. It is, in some ways, a golem, and that's the saddest part. Is that despite the goodwill of many American peoples, they're siphoning that energy and goodwill into furthering their agenda as well. And that's so I think eventually, yes, when they do leave the country and they choose to push the self-destruct button, there will be mini skirmishes in various American cities, especially the very multicultural areas of the country. The country will, I think, disintegrate, similar to how the British Empire melted away, notice, after the First World War. And certainly after the Second World War, it just disappeared, but almost without a bang. Like there wasn't even really, it's almost like the British Empire was there, and then suddenly after the Second World War, and certainly the weakening after the first, just kind of without a whimper, it just left the world stage. I think the same thing may happen to America. It may, in large part, be much bloodier of an affair, but
Yeah.
ultimately, yes, Welsh, I do think that there will be a civil war coming. I just think it's a few decades away. I do think they will milk America dry, and they will make sure that the Americans play their role until the very end on this sort of Talmudic stage. Because at the moment, yeah, the puppeteer strings are still, still in their hands.
Conrad, and I just wanted to point out, Trump is the perfect man to do it. Like he, as you know, that you got, extremist Jewish rabbis. As we all know, Trump is a Kabbalah, person. He's he had a Kabbalah instructor. They say he's on the coin. He's the next Messiah. Some people say he's going to be the perfect candidate for the third temple, this and that. And they're also trying to push him for a third term, which I think could definitely happen. I think they're definitely going to try with that. There's no question how Trump's perfect to bring the Great Israel Project, bring the third temple, and Conrad, we all know that America, as we all know, has been a corporation controlled by the Talmudic Greater City of London bankers since 1913, the Jewish elite, which is that. As we all know, all presidents since then have been puppets. Since 1913, you could argue, John F. Kennedy was a bit different because, of course, he wanted to end the Federal Reserve and get AIPAC to register. But in my opinion, Conrad, even though all presidents have been puppets, Trump, in a way, probably is the worst president ever because you look at the economic damage he's done. He's the most president, who's had the most debt. You could argue Richard Wilson may be worse, but look at all the debt. Look at the destruction Trump's done, especially with Operation Warp Speed. All of the, simping he's done for the globalist elite, especially how he gave the biggest, wealth of transfer to the elite during COVID and all of that. And, all of that other stuff. And he's the perfect guy. He is literally the man who is dragging the perfect Zionist project to make Pax Judaica happen, to make the Jewish elite be able to build their third temple and build, you know what I mean, all that stuff. It's complicated.
No, exactly.
Like all of it, and to push America into a Civil War 2.0. He is that perfect man to do that. I mean,
and especially if he continues to run America for several terms. And here's these people are professional chess players. They are like grand masters on the world chessboard. They leave Americans with no alternative. They say, "Oh, it's either Trump or it's your children, and being trans. They're becoming members of the alphabet community, and they're getting aborted as well." So they've already marked it so much. The game is so rigged that if it isn't Trump and MAGA and the so-called, now apparently Lindsey Graham and friends, the rhinos, and now the Republican Party, they're all conservative, right? If it's not these people, then it's like the worst leftist imaginable that will destroy your country morally. So they have the perfect enemy internally, and they can say, well, Trump and the Third Temple is the only way forward. Sorry, guys, there is no alternative. So they've planned this out, I believe, probably for decades, maybe even from the Obama years, because it appears that Obama has almost prepared and pumped the left wing full of so much degeneracy, right, since those early days in the 2000s, that in fact now it seems like there's no alternative. It's like, well, if you're Christian in America, you have to vote for Trump. And yes, you will get foreign wars, or else you'll get Biden, obviously persecution and prosecution of Christians. You'll receive abortion, and you'll receive, what is a drag queen story hour, right? As it's caricaturishly portrayed, but literally that. And so they leave you with no alternative, and they kind of herd you into the stables. So yeah, it's very devious. I think it's obviously horrifying, and yes, it'll be very interesting. Look, it may happen. The conflict within America may happen during our lifetime, at least, maybe sooner than what I've said. I've said decade, but perhaps you're right. Maybe all they need is for an Israeli expansion in the Middle East, and then they'll let America literally crumble like a clay doll or like a golem that's done its master's bidding.
I think it's going to happen faster. I think it's going to happen this decade or next decade because of Agenda 30. I think America is going to go into civil war in the next coming years or next decade. That's how I feel. I could be wrong, Conrad, but hey, that's just how I feel. So before we finish up, Conrad, where can people find you? How can people find you? And yeah.
Obviously, thank you, Welsh. Amazing podcast. The best place to find our work would be worldwarnow.co. That's the website, that's the Substack, and then all subsidiary links can be found therein. We're on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, obviously on X itself, World War Now _, and many other platforms. But worldwarnow.co is the home base. Subscribe on Substack for amazing content. But generally speaking, Welsh, it's been an amazing time chatting to you. Obviously, a lot of ideas have been thrown around, but thank you for contributing to the community on Discord and participating with everything. It's always good to hear your opinions. I mean, you're a really outstanding guy in terms of you've interviewed some of the top people, I would say in the alternative media space, and even some mainstream people, mind you. So it's really awesome to have this time chatting to you about the things which I think are the most important to myself, which is obviously orthodoxy, my love of the Russian homeland, and the future of Christian peoples around the world.
Well, it was an absolute pleasure to have you, Dmitry. You're fantastic. You're so smart. You're so knowledgeable at things, whether it comes to life and history. It was a pleasure having you. Should definitely do another show in the future. You're fantastic. Well done. Your show is fantastic. So yeah, thank you for joining the show, mate. It was a pleasure having you as a guest. So everyone, please go follow Dmitry, World War Now. He is fantastic. He has one of the best shows on the internet with his friend Conrad, who's also very good and very smart too. Fantastic show. You'll learn so much. Even if you don't agree with him, you can still learn a lot from his show and you can still enjoy it. It's a great show, even if you are going to disagree with him, and it's good. And shout out to him. So yeah, go follow him on Twitter. Go sub to his YouTube channel, World War Now, and go support them on Substack and everything. So thank you, everyone, for joining the Welsh Republic Podcast Space One. And take care, everyone. This will be recorded. Remember to go like and share this around on Twitter. And I will maybe upload this on YouTube, Rumble, if I can, if Twitter will let me do that. But take care, everyone. God bless you all. Stay safe. Thank you for joining. God bless. And never give up. Bye.